So next on the list is symbolic interaction. A symbolic interaction analysis of culture. Now, it's not my job to convince you that one theory or over another makes more sense or is right or is correct. But at the same time, from time to time, when one of them says something I think is just common sense and is simply clearly common sense, I'm going to say that. And when it comes to the symbolic interaction perspective of culture, this is one of those times. Because symbolic interaction says that culture isn't just a reflection of society, it is produced by the society in which it exists. It comes from interaction, communication, socialization, a lot of which I've already discussed. So, as a society, we're constantly producing culture in a variety of ways. It is an interactive process, it's like a never ending cycle. Coming back to language as an example, I think language is a great example of this. How language creates culture and vice versa. And in addition, how culture shifts and changes. Every year, Webster's Dictionary announces a list of new words and phrases that have become commonplace in the last year that it's adding to the official dictionary. Now, it can't just be anything. In order to be included in the dictionary, a word must, quote, be used in a substantial number of citations that come from a wide range of publications over a considerable period of time, end quote. So, for example, in 2016, words that were added to, or phrases that were added to Webster's Dictionary included Bitcoin, TMI, tune, life hack, browsability, YouTuber, and yes, I've got to include this, dick pic was added to the dictionary. I had to explain to my 84-year-old mother what that term meant. Wow. In 2017, new words added or phrases added to the dictionary included binge watch, facepalm, first world problem, and ghosting. I had to have my son explain to me what ghosting is. And if you don't know, and feel free to laugh at me that I'm explaining it, when you ghost somebody, it's like you completely ignore them. So let's say they're on your Facebook and you text and stuff. When you ghost them, it's like all of a sudden you just pretend they don't exist. I had no idea. So on the screen, you see the words that were just released a little while ago that are being added to the dictionary for 2018. Previously, these words and phrases were not officially recognized as words and phrases. Some of them didn't exist at all, whether they were officially recognized or not. I went to high school in the late 80s, and I can tell you that if somebody asked me what a YouTuber was, I'd have no idea what they were talking about. Is that some kind of tube you use in construction or in a garden or something? Or ghosting, and I mean dick pic, I certainly wouldn't have known what that was. If somebody said these to you in 1989, the year I graduated from high school, you'd think they were crazy, which also demonstrates very effectively just how much of a generational difference there can be between parents and children. Um, yeah, I remember reading somewhere that the spread of the internet or the evolution of the internet has caused the biggest generational difference between parents and children since the advent of rock and roll. I don't know if that's true or not, but it absolutely has caused a generational difference. So this is an example of why symbolic interactionism states that culture is not just a reflection of the society in which it exists. Instead, culture is produced also by the society in which it exists. All of us as a group collectively create culture. So according to symbolic interactionism then, we individually interpret the culture in which we exist, and that kind of implies that we can in some way control how culture influences us, at least in part. Is that possible? Is it possible to control how much you're influenced by the culture around you? I'm not sure, but when I think about this, I think about people who have just come to Canada. I think about immigrants and refugees. And in particular, I think of younger people who have come to Canada and how coming to a different country with its own culture and its own way of doing things can affect the dynamic of immigrant families. Now, you will not be asked this information on a quiz or the final exam, but I wanted to give you an idea of how many people we have coming into Canada every year. So this is from Statistics Canada. Look at this. For example, in 2013, all the kids that came to Canada. Think about what that means. I mean, as an adult, we know what it involves. But if you think of being a kid or a teenager, everything that's going on at that time to begin with, and then add in not just moving, but moving to a different country. They might have to learn different social patterns than what they're used to in their country of origin in terms of what people wear, how boys and girls interact with each other, what is and is not acceptable or considered a norm. They might have to learn new norms regarding how they interact with adults. They might have to learn new norms regarding food, adjusting to new food and having people look at them like they're strange or weird if they eat other kinds of food. They might have to learn new norms regarding how to behave in a Canadian classroom. So what this is a whole bunch of quotes from different people who had come to Canada. I put them in different colors just to kind of keep it straight. So take a second and read these, and this is just a tiny, tiny glimpse of issues that probably wouldn't occur to us as Canadians that immigrants would have. So feel free to pause the presentation at this point, and so I'm not rambling in your ear, and read these. Think about going to school. They might have to learn new norms regarding how to address the teacher. In Canada, you should make eye contact. Not to do so would be considered disrespectful. But in other countries, making eye contact with an authority figure is disrespectful. They might have to learn how to interact with other students in class, how to do group work. What if they come from a country where boys and girls are separated most of the time? So if immigrant children are older, they might be exposed to different dating practices, the Canadian norms for interacting with the opposite or same sex as a teenager. And they'll probably feel pressured in various ways to assimilate, either overtly or covertly. Like I said, begin dressing in a Canadian way, begin styling their hair in a Canadian way, to spend their free time differently, to become Canadian, to fit in with everybody else their age. Absolutely, they'll be going through culture shock. At the same time, their parents may be trying to preserve the culture of their country of origin. And it isn't that they don't want their children to be Canadian, but they don't want to completely lose their culture of origin. So their parents might try to control how much Canadian culture affects them. One example that's very, very commonly encountered by teachers working with newcomer students is the issue of language. So that parents insist only on speaking their own language at home in order to maintain it and not completely lose it, even though their children are trying to learn a new one. Why do parents do this? Because they don't want to lose their language. But then they're often criticized for this, as it does make learning a new language much more difficult and take longer. And especially in the summer. So the student has 2 months off and all they do at home is speak their native language, and then they come back to school and they're behind the ball again. So these young people are trying to be good Canadian students and fit in with their peers, at the same time as they're trying to be respectful of their parents and be a good son or daughter by not becoming too Canadian. So they really are caught in the middle. So when I saw this picture, this really stood out to me because I thought, what do kids want to do? Kids, no matter what their age, simply want to fit in. They generally want to be like everybody else. Doesn't mean that they want to be exactly like everybody else, but they don't want to be excluded. And because of this, it can cause a really difficult situation. And it's important to recognize that for the most part, academic success really depends on how well culturally diverse students can adjust to this new dominant culture. how can a student be successful in Canadian society, in a Canadian school, unless they do things the Canadian way? But immigrant and refugee parents don't want their kids to completely 100% assimilate because that would mean losing their language from their country of origin. The traditions and values and beliefs and perspectives and political approaches and maybe cultural traditions regarding dating and marriage and how to dress from their country of origin. And I mean, isn't this what Canada is supposed to be? Don't we celebrate in many ways multiculturalism, which implies not having to completely give up everything from your country of origin? At the same time, we also expect a certain degree of assimilation. And I mean, like I said, kids, no matter where they're from or where they live, generally just want to be kids. They want to have fun and play. And even if they're not concerned with being the most popular, they don't want to be excluded. And especially when you're younger, difference stands out. Another example that you see in the news sometimes. So yeah, here kids just want to be included. They want to be happy when they're at school. I start getting on these rants when I'm talking and I forget to advance the slides exactly where I should. So another example is one that seems to make the news for negative reasons, and that is different norms regarding dating and marriage. Sometimes we'll see article in the news about immigrant youth who want to or who have married somebody their parents did not choose for them. And this is considered horrible for the parents because they are supposed to arrange a marriage for their child. Or even their young people haven't married somebody, but they're simply becoming too Canadianized. They are becoming, they're trying to adopt the cultural traditions of Canada too much in the eyes of the parents. So in Canada, it's not a social cultural norm for parents to choose who their children date or marry. But their parents still want to control their children's social and dating life as they would have in their country of origin. They've moved to a new country that does things differently, but their children are encouraged and sometimes just told to continue practicing the values and cultural practices of their country of origin. So in other words, their parents are trying to lessen the influence of Canadian culture. Now, Canada has always had a reputation for being a country that doesn't require people who come here to completely renounce their country of origin. So they can be Indian and also be Canadian. They can be Nigerian and also be Canadian. And as a result of this, as a result of Canada's focus on and acceptance of and even encouragement of multiculturalism, Canada's culture has become increasingly diversified. If you look at Canada's history of immigration, it used to be primarily Northern Europeans. In other words, the vast majority of people who immigrated to Canada were mainly white and not visible minorities. They may have spoken different languages, practiced different religions, adhered to some different cultural practices, but they were Caucasian, the majority of them. In the 1960s, our immigration policies changed. This meant that who was permitted to immigrate here changed as well as how many people from different areas of the world. Canada officially adopted a policy of multiculturalism in the 1970s, something everybody's familiar with now, so that to us, multicultural communities are the norm. And if you take a look at the statistic cited in the textbook, it says before 1961, 95 of our immigrants came from Europe and the US, and therefore, like I said, not a member of a visible minority. Now, 65% come from outside those two areas. By 2017, approximately 1/5 of Canada was made up of visible minorities. This is a monumental change that has immediate effects for Canada, but also, in the long run, this means that the overall ethnic makeup of Canada will change in the long term. Now, what are we talking about here specifically when we talk about multiculturalism? Multiculturalism is a policy that reflects Canada's ethnic and racial diversity in the past and advances its ethnic and racial diversity today. Very official sounding explanation. And the textbook makes the point that it used to be, if you were a student in Canada, the focus of education when it came to history or culture was on the English and French, because these were the two European groups that came to what is now known as Canada and spread out. English and French are the two official languages of Canada. And having been an elementary school student in the 1970s, I can tell you this is certainly what I remember of my education. I can remember coloring pictures at Thanksgiving of all the happy little Native people and being taught how everybody worked together and got along well, and that's how Canada was settled. And how, yes, reserves were created, and that was fine because Native people had their space and everybody else had their space. A very whitewashed version of history, a very sanitized version of history. Because what this did was neglect or just outright ignore all other ethnic groups and their contribution to Canada in terms of how the history of the country progressed. In terms of, not just in terms of exactly what happened, but in terms of music and art and language and other arts and the sciences, including First Nations people who were already here. And apart from culture, we certainly didn't learn much about how the less pristine side of European settlement occurred. The residential school system. That reserves, yes, were created, but created on land that was for the most part useless. So, multiculturalism, part of our multiculturalism policy, includes the perspective that school curriculum should be more honest, more accurate, to include different perspectives and not just a European one. And in doing this, to be more complete. Because Canada has become more multicultural, and because that is continuing to grow and change the proverbial face of Canada, so our education system should reflect that. It should be inclusive of everybody and offer more than just one perspective instead of depending only on the European perspective. So, for example, getting back to First Nations people and how colonialism proceeded in Canada, it should include all of the things I mentioned that were excluded from my own elementary and high school education, as well as more. Now, what this multicultural approach does is encourage cultural relativism. The chapter makes mention of this, and all this is the belief that all cultures have equal value. And maybe I'm just optimistic, but I think everybody would agree this is positive. I think most people in North America believe this, that somebody else's values and beliefs and religion and even how they dress and what they prefer to eat is just as important to their own culture. Another way of explaining cultural relativism is that it's a principle that a culture and its beliefs and values should be viewed from the standpoint of that culture itself, not from another culture. So it's basically saying don't be ethnocentric. And again, I think for the most part, Canadians agree with this as a positive approach, as a fair one that supports multiculturalism in Canada. However, there is a downside to it, and before you jump on me, hear me out. There is an argument that cultural relativism ends up being detrimental to Canadian identity as a whole. That cultural relativism is an approach that can potentially have a negative impact on society, that what it does is weaken our identity as Canadians, and that it encourages or at least doesn't discourage some cultures that hold values that are in complete opposition to Canadian values. I'm going to give you a specific example. When you think of the RCMP, what do you think of? We think of the uniform, black coat, red coat, black pants, the brown hat. And this is a Canadian symbol that's recognized around the world. And because of this, the RCMP uniform has always been very, very fondly regarded as a symbol of Canadian identity, just like a beaver or a maple leaf. However, this has changed. In 1990, a man named Baltej Singh Dhillon, somebody who immigrated to Canada and was Sikh, who wore a beard and a turban as part of his beliefs and traditions, was accepted into the RCMP training. And he said, quote, "I was given the option that you can cut your hair, remove your turban, shave your beard, and we would carry on with the process as we did with everybody else," end quote. While he was in training, he was allowed to continue wearing his turban. But he filed an appeal with the government stating that wearing a turban was a religious duty that no devout Sikh could shirk, could stop. And preventing him from wearing his turban while in uniform was a violation of his religious rights. So on one side of the debate was the feeling that if you move to a different country, whether that's Canada or somebody else, you have to respect their traditions. While this debate was going on, a slogan that became kind of popular was, "Respect our traditions, wear their hat." But other people felt that part of Canada's values and beliefs were based on religious freedom. And this was an issue of religious freedom and expression. The person in question, Mr. Dhillon, said that, quote, "I've been practicing my religion for the last 23 years. Now, is somebody really asking me to protect a tradition? Or are they asking me to sacrifice my religion, my principles, my disciplines, my respect in the community, the respect I have for my family, and all the other things that tie into this religion," end quote. In 1990, the Solicitor General, responsible for the RCMP, stated that the decision had been made, and according to Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Mr. Dhillon could wear his turban as an RCMP officer. So this wasn't just perceived as a matter of updating a uniform. This decision was perceived to have enormous symbolic significance because it was the blending of a national symbol of Canada with Canada's policy of multiculturalism. There are some other instances, however, where cultural relativism is not the focus, and instead ethnocentrism takes over. And even though we view ethnocentrism as a negative approach, you shouldn't judge another culture based on standards of your own. I bet you would actually agree with the following example, that ethnocentrism is the correct approach. For example, in regards to female genital mutilation, also known as female circumcision. This refers to the ritual removal of some or all of the external female genitalia. It may occur just a few days after birth or at any time up until puberty. The exact procedure varies according to the country it occurs in and who performs it. It might include removal of the clitoral hood and clitoral glands. It might include removal of the inner labia and or removal of the inner and outer labia and closure of the vulva. Another procedure is called infibulation, and that's when a small hole is left for the passage of urine and menstrual fluid. And then the vagina is open for intercourse and then further open for childbirth. The World Health Organization estimates that about 140 million girls and women have experienced this procedure worldwide, mostly in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And in the cultures that practice it, it is highly, highly entrenched in their culture. And they view cultures that don't do it as very odd. They simply don't see it in a harmful manner. In these countries, female circumcision is considered a traditional rite of passage that beautifies women. It prevents promiscuity by guaranteeing purity, guaranteeing modesty, and it protects girls from sexual assault, from rape. It's so prevalent that mothers and grandmothers fear that their daughters may actually be socially excluded and not viewed as marriage material if they don't have it done. That is how strong a social cultural norm it is. And it's usually carried out by women in the community, referred to as a traditional cutter. So these are not performed in medical facilities. And it's not a health professional a lot of the time. Usually performed without any kind of sterile environment, sometimes with anesthesia, usually without. And in some of the countries that practice this, when a traditional cutter is used, they may, in every sense, literally be in a hut or out in the open somewhere with a razor blade, a knife, a piece of glass. And sometimes it will even be used on several girls without being cleaned in between. As a result, there can be recurrent infections. The girl may have difficulty urinating and passing menstrual flow. She may have chronic pain. She may develop cysts. She may actually be unable to get pregnant. There may be complications during childbirth, and sometimes there is even bleeding that leads to death. There are absolutely no known health benefits to female circumcision. None. And that's not being ethnocentric or a Western perspective. In terms of health, there are no known benefits. It has been outlawed or at least restricted, even in the countries where it commonly occurs, but it's very rarely enforced. And some people have the attitude that they have the right to do what they choose, and cultural anthropologists will raise the question of cultural relativism and the need to view this through the eyes of the community and the culture in which it occurs, not through the eyes of your own culture. Female circumcision is a good example of this, of opposition to viewing a cultural practice from the viewpoint of cultural relativism, and one that makes the news periodically when people who have come to Canada from another country want to continue to practice this in Canada, even though Canadian values and Canadian culture do not support it at all. The Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada say that this practice, again, has no known health benefits. It can lead to serious, immediate, and life-threatening health risks, and, not surprising, can be very damaging to a woman's psychological well-being. Now, as Canadian immigration policies have changed, more and more women from these countries have become permanent residents in Canada. So, for example, in 2011, approximately 29,000 women who came to Canada would have already undergone this procedure. And as women of reproductive age immigrate in great numbers to Canada, Canadian health professionals are faced with more and more requests for procedures involving female genital cutting, or for treatment due to a procedure they were subjected to in the past that has caused a health problem. I read one article from the CBC where a female doctor recalled having examined a pregnant immigrant who had undergone female circumcision. And in order to give birth, she had to be what they called defibrillated. So her vagina had to be surgically fully reopened. And then the same doctor saw the same woman again when she became pregnant a second time, and she was shocked to find out that the woman had been re-infibulated. She had undergone the procedure again, and when she asked her about this, because performing this procedure is illegal in Canada, the woman admitted she had gone back to the African country she came from to have it done again, because to her, it was normal. Women who undergo this often become stitched up again after birth. So it's not just a Canadian issue in terms of what actually occurs here in Canada, but in terms of what Canadians may do in other countries. as some immigrants will travel back to their country of origin to have the procedure performed on themselves, either voluntarily or because they're being pressured to do so from their parents, or they'll take their daughters back to their country of origin to have a female circumcision performed, often against the will of the girls, who have become North Americanized and no longer see the practice as normal. Canada is not the only country to face this issue. For example, in France, it is not only illegal to perform the procedure in France, they've made it illegal for immigrant families to take their French-born daughters out of the country for it. Should we do the same here instead of just making it illegal to do here? This is very fuzzy to read, I apologize, but in England, they now have a mandatory reporting duty for doctors who encounter women who have had this procedure done. Should we make it illegal for Canadian immigrants to obtain the procedure abroad? Does that mean they'll stop doing it? Or will they simply keep doing it but then avoid seeking medical help when they return if it's needed? Or will they simply get it done, but get it done kind of under the radar, get it done illegally? So while your first reaction might be to pounce on somebody who doesn't completely support multiculturalism, some people oppose it, at least in part, because they feel that there are certain aspects of other cultures that should not be supported in Canada, that they should be opposed and made illegal, and that too much of a focus on multiculturalism ends up eroding Canadian culture. So that's something to think about. It's not quite as simple and straightforward an issue as it seems, is it? And it really does depend on exactly which issue we're talking about.